Good evening, everyone. We'd like to welcome everyone. I am Sandra Hoover, President of the Napa Valley Genealogical Society. The Genealogy Society has been in existence since 1990.
Oh, the rest of you get.
Sorry. Is that better?
Yes. Much better.
Yeah. I hear it. Well, I am Sandy Hoover, President of the Napa Valley Genealogical Society. We've been in existence since 1974. Our mission is to provide help and instruction for you to research your family history. We are a 100% volunteer organization. Feel free to stop by our library at 1701 Menlo Avenue in Napa to meet our volunteers and explore our collections. We are open every Wednesday from 10 to 1 and by appointment. For more information, including our phone number and website, please pick up one of our brochures at the book table. Listeners at home can Google Napa Valley Genealogical Society.
Good evening. Good evening.
It's not on.
It's not on.
Here, you can have mine.
Yeah, why don't you share?
We're crafty. Good evening. I'm Shelley Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Napa County Historical Society. And we are joined tonight with the Genealogy Society and the Napa County Library to bring a lecture of great importance. And I think it's going to be a delight to listen to. The Napa Historical Society was founded in 1948. We are entering our 75th year. We have been bringing heritage presentations to the public up and down the valley now for 75 years. We're really proud of that. We are a group that is dedicated to discovering, preserving, and presenting the history of Napa Valley as it sits within the history of California, as it sits within the history of the United States, as it sits within the history of the world. And we have for you twice a year new exhibits. We hope you'll come and see. Our exhibit right now is called Hilos Visibles, or Visible Threads. It is a project of the Latin Heritage Commission, and it is a feast for the eyes. We hope you get to see it. We also have a series, as I said, of lectures, and we do walking tours in the summer. If you haven't been with us up to Tulaque, please come. We can scare the wits out of anyone. We are so pleased to be here tonight, and I'm going to now turn this back over to Sandy so we can talk about this important collaboration.
Well, we are very, whoops, wait a minute. Okay. We're very excited about this groundbreaking event. It represents the first time the County Library, the Historical Society, and the Genealogical Society have collaborated on a public event. It also marks the transition from strictly Zoom events to a hybrid format. We thank Tess for setting up and handling the technical details that have made this event possible. Thank you, Tess.
You're welcome.
Tonight's presentation takes us to that moment where we see the intersection of history, genealogy, and the environment. We are very lucky to be here tonight and hear The Inherited Silence by Louise Dunlap, because this nexus where we learn about people, we learn about how they interacted with events and places, makes us understand history better. And as we understand our heritage of this valley better, we are able to better protect our communities, better preserve our heritage, and better understand all of the complexities of the voices that have been heard and unheard throughout history.
My name is Mark Perkins. I'm a vice president with the Napa Valley Genealogical Society. And we'd like to begin at this point with a land acknowledgement, and this is courtesy of the Susquehanna Intertribal Council, a wonderful nonprofit organization here in the Valley. And they are present in many events within the community that have to do with the heritage of original peoples. And they also have a land-based healing project called the Susquehanna House up in Pope Valley. And they provided the wording for this land acknowledgement. We'd like to begin acknowledging that we are gathered on the ancestral and unceded land of the Patwin, Onosatus, Miwok, and Pomo peoples, past and present. May we honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. Just a quick word about the outline for the evening. We're just about ready to turn the microphone over to our guest author, Louise Dunlap. And after she presents, perhaps 40 minutes or so, we're going to open the floor for questions. And because this is a hybrid event, we're going to be going back and forth between questions from you, the audience here in the room, and then our audience by Zoom. So Tess will be looking through the chat and pulling questions from there. So we're looking forward to a very exciting evening. We may go a little bit after 7, but we're told that we can do that. So we'll let the spirit move.
I am Sally Perkins, and I'm also a co-vice president of the Genealogical Society. It is my honor today to introduce our guest author and speaker. She is a very accomplished author, professor, writer, researcher, and a one-of-a-kind human being. And so I will let her complete in her own words her introduction of herself. Please welcome Louise Dunlap.
Thank you so much, Sally and Mark and Tess and Sandy and Shelley and Karen from Bookline. This has been an amazing event to prepare for, because there seems to be so much interest here in the Valley about this book. The book is newly out. I haven't spoken about it too many times. And I'm sorry, I'll be very honest here. I just sent my niece out to the car to get a spare pair of glasses. I can't read without glasses. I want to hear about your ancestors too, but I need to tell you about mine, and I need to read it. So hopefully we find the right glasses. But we don't need them for the first part of the event, which is, I realize many people in Napa may not know me, because I didn't really grow up in Napa or live in Napa, as some of my other relatives did, and many Dunlap cousins. I just told them. Thank you. So we have a short PowerPoint to explain who I am and who these ancestors are that I wrote the book about. So I'll read it since the lights aren't great for everyone's eyes. The silences in ourselves and in our families are like scar tissue over our wounds. This is something in Larry Ward's book.
That's good.
Yeah, that's better, yeah. Larry Ward's book, America's Racial Karma. If you read my book, or as you read my book, you'll see I'm quite a book person, and there's a lot of other people's books are mentioned there. So this is one of them that I lean on quite heavily. He's a Buddhist teacher. And you can go to the next one, Tess.
Okay.
So this is my family. As I first knew them, this was a few years before I was born. But on the right is my grandmother, Amy Louise Coombs Dunlap. Her husband, Harry from Dunlap is on the other side of the photograph. And there are three sons in the middle. And this is by way of introduction. So my father is at Amy's knee, David Dunlap, David Coombs Dunlap. He was the oldest boy in the family. And Gordon Dunlap is up above him, second oldest. I think some of his sons and daughters may be on the Zoom call. And then we have Frank Dunlap in the lower, next to my father. Frank Leslie Dunlap, who raised his children in Napa. Many of you may have known them, and his wife Betty was a school teacher. And then in the upper corner is the wonderful John Dunlap, who I think there are a few friends of his and relatives of his in this room. John Dunlap just passed this past year as he was nearing 100 years old. And he comes up in my book a lot because he's one of the few people in my family I could really point to and say, this man is changing what I call the colonizer mind. He was really a changer. And I hope many of you got a chance to know him in his many roles, politically and otherwise. Gordon moved away to other parts of the state and was a farmer. And David, my father, moved to the city and became a lawyer. It was a family business, so to speak. There were a lot of lawyers in the family. But my father raised us in Berkeley, my father and mother. Read about both of them in the book because in later life they were able to move back to Napa when they retired in a very beautiful piece of land that I'll speak about, that the book is about, and that I'll speak about in a moment. So my two sisters and I were raised in the city, but we came to Napa very often. And we also lived here for a short time during the Second World War, lived in this very house, which is 720 Seminary Street. It's still standing. It still looks somewhat the same. And we lived there. And then again, after the war, when we had no other place to live, we were able to live on this beautiful land that the Coombs family had held since colonization times. So we could go to the next slide now. That's the basic picture of why I'm considered what my Napa contacts are. And I was here a lot during childhood with my cousins for Thanksgiving, Christmas. Now this is Nathan Foster Coombs. He's the brother of my grandmother. And he was the person who lived in the house at 720 Seminary Street at that time. And as you probably might know, he was a lawyer, district attorney, state senator, and he also was the caregiver, steward, but I think we would say owner probably, of this 640 acres out in Coombsville. That was what was left of the family, part of the family land. Now, if we'll go to the next one, I will explain all of this. All right, so these are the parents of Amy and Nathan Foster Coombs. This is Belle Roper Coombs and Frank Leslie Coombs, Frank and Belle Coombs. They were the ones who established that 720 Seminary Street as the Coombs house. And they were quite amazing. Frank was apparently a very he was very good with people, and he was a legislator in the state legislature and Speaker of the House for several terms. And he also was elected to Congress at one point, and also was appointed to be ambassador to Japan at one point. So he had, and his wife, Belle Roper Coombs, was with him in all of these things. And you'll see later, she was quite a letter writer. So a lot of the information that I was able to put together about the family came from her collections of letters. Okay, I think we're ready for the next, and nearly the last slide. And this is Frank's father, Nathan Coombs, whom you are all familiar with now, I know, because we just had the 175th centennial or celebration of the founding of Napa, and Nathan was the founder of Napa. So he was honored a lot for that. I'm going to be reading some things about him tonight. And it's, I think I need to get my readings out now. And maybe we could get the light back on. You can put it on the next slide if
Okay.
you want, but then we can just leave that next slide up,
Sure.
because that's the one that I'm repeating here
Okay.
about the silences. Okay, this is good. Now I can see, and you can see me, and I can see you. Yeah.
But we can't see the space.
You can see the screen, but there's not gonna be anything much to look at except you got that quote in mind. So, yeah. So that doesn't explain much about myself, except just what my parentage was and my life was that in the 1960s, I moved back east and lived in the Boston area for about 43 years, where I was teaching English literature and writing, and especially writing towards the end. And a lot of my story is in one of the early chapters of the book, so you can find out more about that if you want. But I didn't grow up here. I did come here. I did love this place. I still do love this place. And I have many relatives here and feel very grounded here. So, yeah. And I have a few notes here that I'm gonna look at, and then I'm going to be reading two passages. Now this, I don't know how many people have read the book or read parts of the book. I hope a lot of you will read it. It's a very layered book. It has so many different kinds of things in it that I think you mentioned in your introduction, Sally. But there are things I hope you would love as readers. Beautiful oak woodlands, creeks, native plants, mushrooms, migrating birds, traditional ecological knowledge, which is how the original people here, the Nishawa, Anastasis people, helped the land to stay in balance before we got here. There's a lot about that in the book. There's a lot about deepening our understanding of racism and white supremacy, a lot about genocide, even here in the Napa Valley. It was very strong. And there's a chapter, chapter 3. I wouldn't read that chapter without taking some precautions, prayers, being able to really take it in deeply, because it is very deep and very challenging. But those are not the parts I'm going to read tonight. Yeah, I'm going to focus on my settler ancestors. This program is called Telling the Truth About Our Ancestors. And I'm ready to do that. I have to say, I feel a little bit of trepidation. I was raised in the mode of my family. I inherited a tendency to silence. And as I thought about giving this talk, I thought, no one in my family would have done this. This is a little scary to speak about things that your family did not speak about. And that's what I'm going to be doing, reading and doing here tonight. So I'll appreciate your support. I think I do it because I think it's an important thing to do. I'm not doing it out of anger. I'm not doing it out of hate. I'm doing it because I think we need to heal. And that's what the program is about, I believe. Okay. I wrote this book because I love the land. Actually, I was able to live on this beautiful piece of Unk's Ranch, we called it, for a year when I was 7 years old. And that is the time of one's life when you can really get close to land. So I love this land and I wanted to honor it in my book. And I also wrote it because I knew that I wanted to know. I wanted to know the truth about my ancestors' role in the violence of settlement. I knew it was violent, but I didn't know how, and I didn't know if they were involved. They couldn't have been directly involved. I was only able to look at this because I had a Buddhist teacher who said and still says that we are here to heal and to heal our ancestors as we heal ourselves. So I have to believe that. And it's an idea that's big in the non-colonial world. I'm going to make reference later to a teacher from West Africa called Malidoma Somé, who wrote The Healing Wisdom of Africa. And he says in that book often that once our ancestors pass, they realize any harm that they've done and want us to help them set it right. They can't do it themselves anymore. So that gave me a lot of strength, actually, that thought. I also had California Native friends here who on peace walks that I and some other people in the audience were on taught us that we are all to honor our ancestors. Honor your ancestors. So I'm going to read two passages from the book that I hope will show you how hard that was to do and how I managed to do it. And I hope that you can be thinking for yourselves, because I'll ask this question if no one asks any questions in the question period. Do you have some ancestors who need healing? Do you have some ancestors that you want to hate? Or you are, and how are you holding that? Is there any way to do that? So I'll read the two passages. The first one is going to be about Nathan Coombs, whom you just saw, our founder of the city of Napa. We're right here on Coombs Street. And I think we're right at the edge. I'm sorry, I was just a little bit distracted with my glasses during the land acknowledgement of all things, but we're right on the edge of the piece of land that he procured to found the town of Napa. And we're right there. We're right on the spot. So that's important. And also what I'm going to read about has been in the news. And I'll say something about that later. So now we'll go to the book reading in the library. You're supposed to read. So I am going to do that. Sorry. There we go. Now, this is from a section called, the chapter on, that talks about Nathan and how he acquired the land. But I'm not gonna read about all of that, only this part. I spent a lot of time, I should say something about sources. I didn't know that the Genealogical Society was there in 1974. I'm just that, what I knew about was what I found in a few books, few history books. I'm a very amateur historian. I have no training in genealogy, so any of you can do this. And I looked and looked and looked through all the old history books, many of them in the library here, to see what I could learn about the Coombs family. And I went to the Historical Society also, and I learned a few things there. But I could not find anything personal about Nathan Coombs. We also, I should say, had in that house that you saw, 720 Seminary Street, had a big attic. And somebody in the Coombs family was a collector. And they have had tons and tons of letters, which are now in my cousin Helen's care. And I was able to read all of them. And it took me months. But I didn't find anything, only two pieces of paper with Nathan's handwriting on it, nothing personal. So I couldn't find out anything too much, but this is what this chapter this section says. Nothing I could find endeared me to Nathan Coombs. Nothing stirred my heart or made me grateful to share his DNA. But I was relieved to find that so far as I could tell, he hadn't been involved in any of the directly violent attacks on Native people that happened in Napa. Even though some of the men he knew from the Bear Flag days, he was in the Bear Flag revolt, had rampaged through the valley, killing Indians. It didn't seem that Nathan had been directly involved. Scruffy pioneer beard or no, troubled guilty frown or no, that's the only photograph I know of Nathan that you saw. His way of pursuing manifest destiny was the one of land purchases and water companies, where deeds and regulations made the destruction of indigenous life indirect and invisible. That was until I happened upon his census data from the year 1860, just 3 years after the Tula Cave purchase and during his second term in the state legislature. When Nathan was 34 and my great-grandfather Frank was an impressionable 7-year-old. Someone had posted it on a genealogy website. Data from the 1860 census for Nathan's home ranch, which was northwest of Napa. He had a lot of different properties that he had purchased in that early era. Besides family members, the census shows 10 people living that year at the Willows and working for the household. They were laborers, a carpenter, a stock raiser, and 2 others, a servant and a cook, whose names were given as Nancy Coombs, 28 years old, and John Coombs, 24. These 2 names on my laptop screen when it came in the solar plexus. They bore the name Coombs in the census, but I was sure these 2 were not our relatives. No family stories ever mentioned a Nancy or a John, and Nancy was only 1 year younger than Nathan's wife. I knew that in the South, enslaved people were given everyday names like Nancy and John, followed by the master's surname. I'm 21 reading this to you, so. Followed by the master's surname, the infamous slave names. Later, I would learn of a document showing 35 people of African descent sold as slaves in Napa County in 1846, before statehood. But the Coombs family was strongly Republican and anti-slavery. All the same, the names on the screen had the ring of so-called slave names. What if Nancy and John had been indentured California Native people, kidnapped as children, and sold into servitude? This common practice was legally sanctioned by a law passed after statehood. The 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians has a nice sounding name, but it was not a nice piece of legislation. And the very year of the census, with Nathan voting in the legislature, that law was strengthened to allow outright kidnapping and longer indentures for children. The measure was repealed in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment, but Californians, U.S. Amendment, but Californians apparently found ways of continuing involuntary servitude for Native people until 1937, the year before I was born. Slavery was on Americans' minds in 1860 as Congress tried to hold the Union together. But here was California strengthening its indenture laws in ways that would surely encourage enslavement. To get Native children who were typically sold and adopted into indenture, kidnappers grew more and more murderous, often killing the parents in violent raids on their villages. Genocide scholar Benjamin Madley, who wrote An American Genocide, I hope it's in the library. It's a very, very important book for every Californian to read. He recounts probably 100 such raids and says that in 1862, after the legislation passed during Nathan Coombs' term, the killing of adults to capture and sell children into slavery rose to new heights. Madley reminds us that the removal of children from parents or villages, making it hard for a people to reproduce itself, is a defining mark of what we later came to call genocide. Wow. I remember that Nathan's, I'm going to just stop because I need a breath and say that a couple of days ago, I received information about a link that a podcast that the American Civil Liberties Union of California has put together about this very issue. And I will try to make it available to you, but it says the same thing that I'm saying. And one of the reasons that they put it together is because the Supreme Court of the United States looked yesterday at evidence about a related issue about children being adopted Native children being adopted out of their families and villages. And we have a law to protect against that now, but the Supreme Court is looking to the people appealing to the Supreme Court would like it to be rescinded or changed. So this is very important right now. Oh, okay. I remembered, I knew this was going to be stressful. I remember that Nathan's fellow bear flagger, one of the Kelsey brothers, was known for rounding up homo from Lake County and selling them to other settlers. And what better customer than his old buddy from Bear Flag days? Had Nathan's family my family gone this route over the hills in Ukiah. One of Medley's sources claimed most white homes held 1 to 3 Indian children in servitude. All the clues I could find put my family in this majority. I concluded that at the height of his influence, Nathan's wealth relied on many people working for him, including at least 2 who had been forced to give up their true names and were likely in involuntary servitude. I don't have hard evidence, but that's how I make the inferences here. I thought a lot about this. Nathan's wife had grown up in Taos, New Mexico. She was a Mexican citizen at birth. And I thought, let's see what's happening there in terms of slavery. I found a book called The Other Slavery by Andres Mezendes, which I also recommend. Andres tells us that despite prohibitions of slavery, starting with Queen Isabella, every white man, woman, and child in early Santa Fe had 2 to 3 native servants in what Resendes called a kaleidoscopic system of layered abuse. So there were ways of not calling it slavery, but it was slavery. Then I wondered about where Nathan's family came from, New England. And I found that a study by Margaret Newell suggests that New England colonies warred with Indians explicitly to acquire captives as slaves. After King Philip's War, during which settlers fought Confederated tribes, the colonial government posted lists of families receiving Indian captives. Captured children were put forth into service, and adults were shipped as slaves to other colonies, such as Virginia and Barbados. Now, these are things we did not learn in my school about slavery. And they're very close to home, very close to home. So that's the end of that particular reading. Let's just take a couple of breaths here, because I can tell that this is heavy. I learned, actually, I first heard this at one of the hearings that I went to of the Napa School Board about the school mascot. One of the people who spoke said he had learned that in indigenous communities and native communities, we don't talk about genocide and enslavement and these heavy things without ceremony, without prayer. So any way that you have to do something like that, I think it would be good. Moment to breathe myself. Drink some water. So the second passage that I'm going to read is about a woman named Ella E. Roper. She was Belle Roper's aunt. You saw Belle Roper. And she didn't live in Napa at all. She was a teacher in New England. But she visited many times because her brother and my great-great-parents, grandparents moved here to be with Belle after she married Frank. And they, as I said, I got to know these people pretty well through this huge collection of letters. And one of the most prolific letter writers was this Aunt Ella. And actually, I bet if any of you have family letters from the 1890s in your attics, that they would probably be very similar, but everybody there routinely spoke in ways that I found really offensive about race. There were, and Ella was one of them. She was a teacher. She actually went as a teacher to the South after the Civil War and started a school for African-American girls. But she wrote home about making fun of the sounds of the voices of the servants in the school. And I just wondered that kind of paternalism, what it would do to the children in the school. Anyway, I had some trouble with Aunt Ella in those letters. She was one of those relatives I didn't know how to love, and I didn't know how to forgive. Now, when I came to the chapter where I decided to look back at the Ropers and Coombses as their lives had been in New England, I had to lean on Ella Roper a lot, because Ella Roper was a genealogist, and she had written, I don't know if you have her book, but we have a copy in our family. Maybe we can get it to library sometime. It's a big, thick book, and she researched all the everything. The Roper family came from England as dissenters or Puritans in 1637, and they settled in an outlying area of Boston and were subject to many in the Indian Wars that happened there. They were right on the front lines, and the Roper family was actually many members of the Roper family were killed by attack in attacks by the Dunlap people who were trying to get their land back, and so that was one of Ella's reasons for doing this genealogy. She wanted to honor these people. So I learned a lot about that. I also learned from another family genealogist whose book is in the Napa Library, Joanne Rigdon Williams. I learned that through Nathan Coombs's mother, he was descended from 3 different families on the Mayflower. So their families all went a long way back. And I want to recommend to anyone who has those New England ancestors who came here in the early days of settler colonialism, read a book called Seasons of Misery by Kathleen Donegan. She's a historian and literary person who wrote a wonderful book based on written accounts from the settlers of just how scary and unsettling it was emotionally, mentally, how traumatic it was to be in those settlements. So I got a lot of empathy from my relatives because I think that being a perpetrator, I've read a lot of books on this subject too, being a perpetrator of harm also causes its own kind of trauma. And a lot of them had to deal with a lot of that. So anyway, I'm going to read about Ella. I think that's enough background. Oh, one other thing I must tell you. I didn't learn this from Ella, from another offbeat book about English literature. someone has done a study of the Puritans' understanding of grief and mourning. The Puritans didn't think we should have grief or mourning. It was sinful. It was questioning the will of God. And so when somebody's children would die, they would not go to comfort them. They left grief out of the picture. This is the church that became the Unitarians. This is the church. It must have picked up grief in the meantime, but in the early days they didn't believe in grief. So one of the main things I write about in this chapter is how much grief has been silenced in our long history. How much grief has been silenced. These are different issues from what Indigenous people have to work with. Very different issues. But they're also very soul wounding. Before I read this, here's something I wrote that I thought was important to tell you, and I'm just going to fit it in right here. I meant to say it earlier. Working on this book, you can tell this from what I was talking about. Working on this book and about the land and my ancestors has enlarged, deepened my perspective on our history, on what went wrong and what was silenced, and how traumatic it was, not only for those harmed, but also for the perpetrators, and how much we need new kinds of thinking and practices, and some of them are very ancient, to help us avert some of the hard things that are facing us now with the earth crisis and social crises that are deepening around us. So now I'm ready to read about Aunt Ella. Oh. This is in a section called How to Honor Our Ancestors. How to honor these ancestors. And this is the last passage I'll read. Ella introduced her book with a kind of time travel, inviting all Roper descendants to join her in the small Dedham home of grandfather and grandmother Roper, newly arrived. She invited us to come with loving reverence, for they are our very own, with tender sympathy, for they suffered sorely. Ella's words touched me, despite our different perspectives on the story. Somehow, I was able to put aside my preconceptions and listen to this distant aunt closely enough to sense a suffering far more complex than the one she likely had in mind. I felt the reverence she urged because I was starting to understand how deeply my entire family had been unsettled by our history. Traumatic experiences as colonizers had separated them from their best selves as human beings. Instead of blaming them for their legacy of unhealed trauma, grief, and silence, I now saw their lives as part of a much larger drama. If they could be healed, it could help to transform what was stuck in our country. I remember Nalli Somay's teaching that once they pass over, ancestors can see the harm they caused and are eager to help us right it. We were in this together. I began to see these ancestors with love. It amazed me that Ella, back in 1904, by no means sharing my understanding of the story, had been the means of passing insight on to my generation. Ella remained the woman I'd come to know in her letters, the one who disdained mixed marriage, made fun of black servants, and appalled me with her venom about the table manners of farm workers. Yet I was touched by her way of telling our story. She didn't demonize Indians, hadn't gone over to hate, as other family historians might have done. She didn't pontificate. She had diligently sought the kind of information that a century later would help to clarify the spiritual burden our ancestors carried, that she also must have carried. As Deborah Miranda, the native author, had said about white people in her memoir of tribal survival from the California genocide, the beginnings of awareness are good to see. And I could see awareness beginning in Ella. She had passed information down the generations so that we would be able to build on that awareness. With all our differences, Ella now emerged as a kind of midwife to the work of intergenerational healing, helping with her own level of insight from more than 100 years ago. I wondered about all those others in the many generations of Ropers and Coonses on the continent. So many human beings whose stories were not told in the genealogies. How many deep in their hearts had objected to the wars? How many were shushed for speaking up for Indian people or shunned for making friends with them? How many focused on ways to grieve found ways to grieve despite the prohibition, or felt uncomfortable being considered part of a chosen race? I was sure the seeds of a more compassionate mind were there in our lineage, but those hadn't been talked about either. As my own heart opened, I could appreciate Ella's complexity. She was more than the privileged commentating on other cultures I found fault with, more than a booster of manifest destiny. She was also a dear elder, modeling as best she could whole soul love of our ancestors. Regardless of how she understood it in her conscious mind, Ella had transmitted information that made it possible to see all the way back to the foundational experience of settler colonialism, to understand the dynamics of our ancestors and our country. What I now felt for Ella must be what the Shellmouth Walkers had called honoring the ancestors. Aunt Ella Roper, with all her imperfections, was an ally in our mutual healing, something we still needed to work on. In the big picture, she had my respect. I'm just going to say also that I include myself as someone who needs to work on these things. I have found the colonizer mind in myself over and over and over again as I wrote and published this book. And I say this with humility and hope to change. So this is the very last part. I sat in my meditation space one morning, my distress levels rising, the beautiful hillside in climate crisis, the racial hatred, militarism, melting ice, disappearing species, and recovering rivers. A world that needed healing from the harm my people had set in motion. I held my pain where I could feel it hurting and just sat there without trying to get myself cheerful again. In the Buddhist way, I held it and just kept breathing. After some time, I felt a kind of eruption inside. The stuck pain exploded and began to flow somewhere. I felt myself surrounded by weeping, screaming, howling ancestors. Those faces I had once seen on the dim parlor walls of the Coombs house now rose up around me. Frank and Belle and Ella were there, and all the Ephraims of the Coombs sufferers no longer posed portrait faces, real feelings bursting out, stored under the surface for generations. Misguided pride, anger, fear, and shame broke wildly through the silence. A howling mass of miserable spirit faces, grimacing, roaring with pain, baring their teeth, biting their own lips until the blood ran down their chins. Hair flying wildly out of pompadours, pilgrim hats askew, tall collars awry, face powder running down cheeks. These people were grieving. At last they were grieving, and I was howling and sobbing along with them because it was also my grief. This was what happened when you bottled it up for a lifetime, for many lifetimes. Did this pain come with us from Europe, from brutality there and loss of connection with those forests and open moors? We too had been colonized long ago by invading peoples, later punished for petty crimes on the rack. Our women tortured and killed as witches. A likely ancestor of Mayflower pilgrim Thomas Rogers had died at the stake, this is a quote, bathing his hands in the flames as if it had been cold water. Coming here, we surely brought the pain with us. Sherry Mitchell, the Knobscot teacher from Maine, another person to read, says we were drawn here because our deepest selves knew that people on this continent still had the earth-based understanding we'd lost. But we couldn't recognize it. Things seemed miserable here. There was no food at first. Our people died around us and we lost our minds, attacked one another and those who lived here. We fed our fear, refused to grieve, started wars for land and captives who could labor for us. He didn't call it slavery, but it was. In those wars, we became as brutal as we imagined the enemy to be. We scalped and tortured, dismembered corpses, killed women, picking huckleberries, and the enemy fought bravely. It was their land, and their people were being massacred. They killed too. There is no record of us grieving or mourning, either our own dead or our own lost humanity as combatants. No mourning for whatever drove that journey across the wild, heaving ocean. Officially forbidden by our Puritan ancestors, grief was dangerous and to be sublimated into pious actions. 4 centuries later, we are finally letting it out in a huge intergenerational wailing. The pain changes. It does not go away, but it changes. They don't look so tormented. And I no longer feel so powerless. I thought this whole thing would be about your questions, so, but we have some questions from the floor.
Yes, yes, we would like to give anybody an opportunity to ask Louise a question. And we have this microphone that we can deliver.
Were you gonna ask a question first?
Well, I'll tell you what, I will just, I don't think I will, but it had to do with the journey from the kick in the solar plexus that you felt when you saw what you saw in the 1860 census to the love that you felt in the letters with Aunt Ella. But I think you've kind of described that journey a bit. So let's see what other people have to.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm not sure exactly how to say what I'm feeling, but I was really, really moved by that last passage that you read. And I took a 17-week trip across the country this summer, and I stopped in, I couldn't even stop in Civil War spots because it was still too soon. So I pushed back and I was stopping at all these Revolutionary War era and colonial era sites. And I found myself most days dissolving into tears and not being able to put a jaunty Instagram post up. And what you said in that vision really spoke to me. Thank you. Not a question. No, but please listen, that is beautiful. I've done that myself.
Yes, do we have anything?
We don't have any at this point.
Nothing at this point in the
No.
chat, okay. Other people here?
It's, it kind of touches the place in me. It touches a place in me. My sixth great grandfather was named Yana Gusta. And it means bear drowning. He was what they call a peace chief in the Cherokee Nation, North Carolina. And that meant that the war villages had to ask them if they could go to war. But I'm trying to give, I guess I'm getting off the subject. The subject is that that was my sixth great grandfather. There's plenty of Celt in my veins, more Celt than Cherokee. Hard. But anyway, every time people would criticize, especially Cherokees, man, I was like, those were great people. Now, people are people. Your ancestors, my ancestors, the white ones, were people. So are the Cherokees and the Omos and all those other people. So I was reading an article about the Cherokees, a historical sketch of the Cherokees, and it described some of the things that they did to other Indians. It was awful. And it showed me they're just as bad as we are. You know, so I don't want to take the blame because I'm mostly Celtic. I don't want to take the blame for that. And I'm gonna throw it right back in their face when they say, look what the white man did to you. I'll say, yeah, look what you did to us. Look what you did to me. So I'm not in love with punishing myself.
Yeah, yes, thank you. We, one of the introductory things I didn't get a chance to say, I was flustered about my glasses. This whole subject is so complicated. A simple answer does not exist. Something I struggled with a lot in writing this book and doing the research for this book is what sources do I use? Am I reading a source that's coming directly out of the colonizer thinking? Or am I reading a source that's coming from the people themselves? And I tried to balance. I think, yes, if harming other, violence and harm to others comes from trauma, all humans have been traumatized, there's going to be some everywhere. But some of it is institutionally supported. And it's we're living in a very important time right now where we have to sort through some of these misunderstandings that have arisen about the peoples here.
I appreciate your story very much. Do you have the card for the Celts or the Cherokees?
Oh, sure.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we do have one
Yes, we have a
question.
question from the chat.
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Will signed copies of the book be available at Bookmine?
Yes, so, the books I have here are not signed. When you purchase one tonight, you can take it right over to Louise and she'll sign it for you. And whatever isn't purchased, we'll have her sign tonight and take them back to Bookmine and. If we end up needing more, we'll figure out a way to get those signed.
Yeah.
And if you have a book that you brought with you that you'd like signed, I'm sure you'd be delighted to.
Of course, of course.
I grew up in the South and lived most of my life on the East Coast. And I was so surprised to read the book Ishi
Oh,
and to learn. I thought those things happened other places. And my question is really, I get the sense that the Native Americans in this area were peaceful. I mean, I don't, do you know whether there was a history of warfare among the Native Americans here, or was it as peaceful? Because they seem to have just had all these things happen to them without any particular fighting back.
I can lean back. That's a really interesting question. I wish I had. I think when you read my book, and here's what I would really read is a book called We Are the Land, a book about California Native history that just came out sort of at the time I was sending my book off to the publisher. And the California tribes were very different from tribes that you would know about in other parts of the country. And at the same time, the attack on them was very different because, as I say in my book, the people who came here for the gold rush had already for several generations been involved in taking over the continent from tribes. And they decided to do it fast when they got here. And so the book about, there are two books actually about the California genocide. And that was another thing I forgot to say. I had no idea you should really use the term genocide when I started to do this book. I thought that might be an exaggeration. Oh, no. Even when you read chapter 3 of my book, I think you'll see that the term is very appropriate. And the reason this is so important is I heard today a news broadcast about one of the cases that's being heard before the Supreme Court at this moment, or yesterday, the arguments for yesterday. One of the justices said the case is actually about a law that protects Indian children from adoption outside of their people, outside of their tribe, or outside of their family. I think I mentioned it earlier. And one of the Supreme Court justices said something publicly about the tribes here were very more on this continent were very more like, and they were always fighting. Well, that's not really true. And that's part of the mythology that we created in order to justify settlement. And when people are attacked and pushed and have no resources, fewer resources, they might get more warlike with the other people that are nearby. So a lot of it is an artifact of colonization, and I don't think there's been a study really about violence of tribes. And I think from what I have learned, there was jostling for resources, but not amongst tribes. But there were lots and lots of ways of sorting that out. The Iroquois Confederacy, for one thing, which is the model for the way we created a system of federation, a federated system for our state and national government. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think it's a very fascinating subject, important for all of us to know, to weed out the mythology that was created to help to settle the land from what was true, and B, to look at the immense diversity of peoples that inhabited this continent and their amazing customs, many of which are still, I don't know if that was a hard one to answer, but a good question.
Yes, do you have one?
I have a question from the chat.
Mhm.
Nancy wanted to thank you for your work in your book. Her question is that a goal of hers in her lifetime is to find a way to give land back to the Native Americans from the area. Are other people already doing this in Napa Valley? And if so, what would be the steps?
I am so glad for that question, Nancy. Yeah. I do not know what's happening in the Napa Valley, but all over the country, there is I'm so excited about that question because it's something I would have liked to be able to do with the land that my family had, did not work out that way. But I'm really eager to support various land return and land back opportunities that are going on around the country. There's a beautiful one in Sonoma County that I have supported a little bit called Heron Shadow. It's a farm that was sold at a very, very low price to the Cultural Conservancy in San Francisco. And they made it available to an intertribal group to take care of. It's an 8-acre piece of land. They are doing a beautiful job. You can look it up online, Heron Shadow. And it's a wonderful model. It takes a long time to figure out how to do this. Again, just yesterday, I came up with a wonderful resource. Our friend who probably is on the Zoom screen gave me this resource, and see if you can write it down in your minds. Nuns and Nuns, N-U-N-S and N-O-N-E-S, Nuns and Nuns. It's a wonderful sounding group with a very good website, mostly about land justice. And there are stories from all over the country told in great detail as YouTubes or podcasts or whatever about families finding ways to give land back, all different ways. Teams up, work with a land trust. You know, there are so many ways of doing this right now. And I don't know if any of you are active with the Land Trust of Napa County Land Trust. I know a couple of people are that are there. They had a walk, they held a walk earlier in September, I guess it was, right after my book came out, called A Walk with Napa's First People. And they'll do it next year. So if you look on their list, you'll see And you can go for a very mild walk, even I was able to do it for a couple of hours with three land-oriented members of the Mishua Unastatis tribe. And they taught us chants, they shared food from the plant life and herbs and told stories. It was absolutely wonderful. I would like to see those three people in charge of a very large piece of land in Napa County that they could tend in the way that they did before and have a place to live. So anyway, that's if you can send those links
Yes.
to the people on the Zoom call. I anticipated questions, and believe me, this book is really hitting a moment when people are very interested in one or another of the themes in it. So there's a lot going on in the world. And I put some links together that just came through to me in the last few days. I'm going to say something quickly about some other links because I can see that the time might be ready for this. Would you put up the Bibles?
Do you have
Oh,
it up?
you did? put it
Yeah.
up. Good. Yeah. Nobody is quite asked about this, but there are a lot of groups right now seeking to go deeper into looking at white folks' ancestry with an eye to reparations, some kind of reparations. And I wanted to tell you about the first two on this list are friends of mine. They're younger women. Morgan Curtis is the youngest. She's 31. And she has been for 3 years giving these 6-month courses online for people who would like to look at their ancestors and with an eye to giving back. And right now, she's at Harvard Divinity School as a student, and she was asked to give this course as a class in Harvard Divinity School, which she is doing at this moment. I had an email from her today. So her website is full of wonderful resources in the description of this course. The next woman, Hillary Javali, is also goodrelative.com, has a wonderful website with a lot of resources, also is giving a similar course that's ongoing at the moment. I also put Molly McGettigan Arthur on this list because you all should know about her. She is a descendant of General Vallejo, who lives in this area. And she has been for years and years collecting information and doing teachings, particularly in the Catholic community. And she has a super website, Waking Up to Our Own Christian History. A plug for Molly. And there are another couple of
We don't quite have time to go over them right now.
Okay.
I'll put them into the slides. Recording is gonna be available on the Napa County Library's YouTube channel next week. It's linked on our website, and also if you just go to YouTube and put in Napa County Library, it'll come up. So all of those resources will be there. So you're welcome.
all this information. Well, the thing is, you can go deep into this stuff. And I hope some of you will. There are also a lot of other interesting kinds of things in the book that I haven't talked about, such as climate change and how we take care of our land, all kinds of stuff.
That's a good reminder that your book is going to be available. It is available right now at the table over there. I know there were some other questions, but I think we need to bring this to a close for tonight. And I wondered, Louise, were there any final thank yous that you wanted to?
I'm just so grateful this could take place. And I think Mark and Sally maybe had the first idea about it. And I really enjoyed working with them and would love to hear more about their stories with their ancestors, because they've been doing a lot of the same traveling with them. And I loved also working with Shelley, who I don't see here, but maybe she's still here. Oh, yeah, she's way back. Yeah. Thank you, Shelley, for bringing the Napa Historical Society into this. And also book mine. And you know, I want to thank those 3 people who guided us on that walk that I just mentioned. The people we call the Wapo. That was such a, they offered what they offered with such love and such attention and affection. And I want to also thank the Susquehanna Intertribal Council for all the work that they do here with this issue. And just, I think we have a chance right now, as I've said before, to start thinking in some new ways. And it might take tears. It might take working together in different ways, but I'm really grateful for this start.
And all of us who organized it, I want to thank you for coming out tonight and everybody on Zoom. And we hope that you'll find ways to keep the conversation going.